So one of the major aspects of being a communist during the 1950s was the prosecution of party members under the Smith Act of 1940. So maybe you can explain the original motivation of the 1940 Smith Act.
The Smith Act and later the McCarran Act were two major efforts based on Congress to outlaw the American Communist Party. The Smith Act was directed specifically to that. It not only attempted to outlaw the Communist Party, which was a challenge to the Constitution, but it made membership in the Communist Party illegal. That is, any individual who was a member of the Communist Party was subject to prosecution under the Smith Act. As a matter of fact, the Smith Act was used to round up organizers and people who were associated with the Communist Party all over the country. And they were directed against people who actually held positions of leadership, either locally or in the very first place, nationally. The most famous victims were the National Board of the Communist Party, where people who were convicted under the Smith Act served many years in prison, some up to 5 years in prison. And what I should interject here, I'll come to it again, is that they served 5 years in prison under a law which was eventually, within a very few years, declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States, which means that the function of the Smith Act was really a punitive function, and even though it eventually was turned down by the courts, the damage that it did was enormous to people and their families. At least one person died in prison. Another person was blinded. A black man by the name of Henry Winston, who was a leader of the Communist Party, came out of prison blind. I think another had a skull fracture in prison. So that's the story of the Smith Act. It was a major legislative effort. And it's really interesting because the communists were being accused of being un-American, and the Smith Act was actually declared by the Supreme Court after the damage was done to be un-American, to be a violation of the Constitution of the United States. The other major act was the McCarran Act. Now, in my case, this was the more important act for me personally, because although I could have been picked up under the Smith Act, that was always a possibility, the government decided to go after so-called front organizations, which were a number of as many as 200 or more that were on the Attorney General's list as subversive. It included youth organizations, fraternal societies, civil liberties and civil rights groups like the National Negro Congress. It was a huge list which had been used actually ever since the Truman administration as a punitive weapon, where a lot of people were fired as a result of that from their jobs. The actual McCarran Act itself set up a process where any of these so-called front organizations, over 200 of them, each one was subject to a hearing with a hearing officer appointed by a Subversive Activities Control Board. That was the name of the board under the McCarran Act. And a hearing was held, after which the organizations were declared not just on the Attorney General's list, but specifically on the Subversive Activities Control Board list under the McCarran Act. Now, the meaning of that was that the leader of any such organization, for example, I was the primary executive in the Labor Youth League, I had the option of either turning over all of the membership list to the McCarran board, or, this sounds ridiculous, but it's true, serving 5 years in prison or 5 years, or 5 years in prison and $5,000 daily fine for refusal to comply. That was the actual statute under the McCarran Act. Now, the McCarran Act, along with the Smith Act, was declared unconstitutional, but it lingered for years. And while I was lucky to be picked up under the McCarran Act simply because the process was longer, and ultimately I didn't have to serve a prison term despite the extreme penalties that were authorized under the McCarran Act. But there was an effort to make things look democratic, so that required a longer process and so-called hearings. I was before the the control board of the McCarran Act, I think for something like 13 days, 3 on direct testimony and the rest on indirect. The prosecutor set up under the McCarran Act was the very same man, I forget his name for the moment, who prosecuted W.E.B. Du Bois in a passport case where he was denied a passport by the U.S. government. Anyway, that was a process that was duplicated for each of these organizations. Now, there was another McCarran Act called the McCarran-Walter Act. That was the third leg of the stool. Under that McCarran Act, they actually set up concentration camps in the country which were waiting to receive masses of people. Now, obviously, this is an extremely important part of American history, such as the Japanese internment during World War II. But it's a hidden part. Nobody knows about it, even though in each case, the courts ultimately overruled it. But they were extremely important vehicles in the whole hysteria that was generated by McCarthyism. And of course, as was indicated by the whole concept of front organization, it was directed not just as a handful of communists, but as so-called fellow travelers, sympathizers, anyone who disagreed with the Korean War, which was ongoing at the time, anyone who was critical of the foreign policy of the government, and so on. So it was a very wide, sweeping blanket. It differs from the present situation simply in that the McCarrans and the McCarthys never got complete control of the government and the courts, something which is threatened today during the Trump administration, which doesn't have the same legislative props as yet, but is clearly moving in the same direction. It was tough. Some people not only went to jail, but other people went underground to sort of preserve the organization. In the long run, it didn't work because the organizations were pretty much decimated. It included, by the way, labor unions, so-called left labor unions. There was a whole group of them that were punished under the McCarran Act. And along with it went sort of the the stigma that if you were subject to the McCarran Act, you were someone who was a target in any organization that you took part in. So it was a general hysteria which had an enormous impact. It took courage. I remember standing on a street corner when I was leaving home, expecting to be picked up by the Smith Act, which never really materialized. So I went away from home. I didn't know when I'd be back, but as it turned out, it was a stupid decision, and we changed our minds, and I came back, something like 6 months later. But my family didn't know when I was going to be back. I didn't know when I was going to be back. I was living in so-called safe houses, going from place to place. And I remember my daughter, who was maybe, 7, 8 years old at that time, probably 8, crying on a street corner in New York as I was leaving. And my son, who was 3 years or 2.5 years younger, soothing her and telling her not to cry. So these were very trying times. And it's a shame that they aren't common knowledge at a time when civil liberties is again moving in a direction that's so dangerous as it is today. While I'm describing my adventures, I should also say I was before the House on American Committee. Also, I was subpoenaed. And I think I wrote about that in my book. I refused to answer questions, which you had to do because if you answered any questions, the next question was identify this one, identify that one. So anyway, there was an intermission and was presided over by Congressman Walter of the McCarran-Walter Act. And there was an intermission, he went out, and there was a group of young Christian students from a Christian school that was there to see how Washington worked. And I overheard the leader say to them, "You see, if he had nothing to hide, he would have answered the question." So I went over to them and I said, "I have nothing to hide to you. I'll answer any question you have." And I identified myself, my views and so on, and told them why I would talk to them completely honestly, but I would withhold from. And as we were talking, Walter came in and he said, "Throw the bum out." and the guard, a guard, escorted me out, and on the way apologized to me. One of my fates was that I always, whenever I was in trouble, there was somebody who was always sympathetic. I was thinking the other day that I'm probably the only person alive who attended national board meetings and national committee plenums of the Communist Party during the McCarthy period, during the Korean War. I don't know of anybody else who's still alive. So that justifies the interview, I guess.
Yeah.
But it wasn't as important as it seems. I was sort of a hanger-on. The next big turning point, of course, is when I got out of the Labor Youth League. I was still in the party and working with Eugene Dennis, who was the general secretary of the party, who had just spent a long prison term under the Smith Act. And I guess the next big turning point was the Khrushchev report. There was no American who attended the 20th Congress where Khrushchev made the report, but the Canadians were there. Tim Buck was the head of the Canadian Communist Party, and he got a copy of the Khrushchev report to the leaders of the American Communist Party. And Dennis showed it to me and had me bring it to Foster, who was the long time head of the party, chairman of the party. And then something which I wish had never happened. They convened a national meeting of the Communist Party, I guess about 100 people from all over the country. And Dennis asked me to read the Khrushchev report. That triggered off a very sharp internal fight within the Communist Party of the United States. What there was of it. It had been decimated and fractured by the whole McCarthy period, imprisonment of its leaders, the fact that people went underground, and so on. But this broke it up into two factions, one of which was led by Johnny Gates, was extremely hostile to the Soviet Union, and made a complete 180% turn. And the other, which was Dennis and Foster, which soldiered on. They weren't exactly the same, but they were against joining the parade of attacks on the Soviet Union, and they were essentially for continuing the Communist Party with some minor changes. The Gates group actually was moving toward dissolution of the party. Well, neither one of these factions had my support. I never was enthusiastic about those kind of factional fights anyway, which played a role in communist history before I was born. But I didn't agree with either one. I felt, number one, that the concept we had of the party as eventually, somehow, some way, becoming the leader of the American working class and leading the American people to socialism was ridiculous at that point, that it wasn't going to happen that way, that if people believed in some sort of socialist transformation, they would have to find new ways to develop it, and that I, as a former member of the Communist Party, would still be looking for those ways. I remember saying to my brother at the time, when I actually left the party, that I hope that in a period of 10 years or so, I'll be able to be fully politically active and in a new way, and hopefully with new possibilities. So that was one thing. I felt that the party didn't have a future, and that something new, which nobody could project at that point, would have to develop in life. The second thing I thought was that I had a complex view of the Soviet Union, which I've expressed up to now. And that lasted for as long as the Soviet Union lasted. That is, even though I recognized the terrible flaws and crimes and so on, I still felt that on a world scale, it was possible for the Soviet Union to play a significant role on anti-colonialism, on support for movements which were being devastated by Western capitalism throughout Latin America and Asia. There was what had happened in Chile, there was Nicaragua, there was El Salvador, there were the mass murders in Indonesia, there was the flirtation with Pinochet. In other words, during the Cold War, which people overlook entirely now, there was a program being carried out which was anti-democratic all over the world. And build-up of the military, build-up of the nuclear weapon. And I saw the Soviet Union, especially after the Khrushchev report, as containing within it at least the elements of change for the better. I don't think I appreciated how bad things were. I appreciated and took completely for the truth the stories about Stalinism in the past and so on. That didn't bother me. But I don't think I really appreciated the degree of stagnation that was taking place in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Brezhnev period. And that was very important because by the time that Gorbachev came around, what undermined him, and I'll check with you on this, was not just the old crimes of the Stalin period, but was the stagnation, corruption, dysfunction of Soviet society. So it's fascinating that Gorbachev had enormous support around the world, but he didn't make it, not only because there were plots from the old-timers against him, but because he didn't have the people with him. They were fed up. And so he was left without a base. To my mind, that was a very important turning point because it was sort of the last chance for some turn to the better half of the Jekyll and Hyde movement that had developed. All the way through the Soviet history, there were tendencies that we would call today democratic socialist tendencies, but they were either beaten down or they suffocated in the period of stagnation, where the United States suddenly went ahead by leaps and bounds with the development of new technology, and more the backwardness of the Soviet Union became an enormous factor. And it was that, more than anything else, that brought about the end of the Soviet Union. So I don't know, it's a game that I can't help playing, but it's a sort of a fruitless game because you can't redo history. But I think to myself that there were turning points. And the reason that's where a willingness to embrace, to take chances in a democratic sense. You don't know what the outcome will be. Rather than to refuse to take chances and to slide further and further into autocracy. There were times when the balance could have been shifted the other way. I think Khrushchev tried.
Khrushchev tried, and Khrushchev's
And
decade was a pretty liberal one.
Yeah, and he got ousted because again there was this constant falling back, retrenchment. They had to have the notion that we are supreme, and that nobody else makes any sense. And it wasn't just Stalin. I mean, it was a corrupting of the society.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think that's very unfortunate. So you get back to why I left the party. I didn't leave the party out of antagonism to the ideas of socialism or to movements for socialism. I didn't leave it out of antagonism to the Soviet Union. I still had hope, even though I was certainly no longer a loyalist in any sense. But I had hope because I felt the world would be better off. And I think everything happening today proves that. If it was multipolar, that is, if there were a variety of influences at work, and even at the heart of the Cold War, the very existence of the Soviet Union as a counterpole to Western imperialism made it possible for Scandinavian countries, for India, to have a little bit of elbow room, for Yugoslavia in that period. So, anyway, I guess fundamentally I clung to hope so long, even up to the present to some degree, because I still believe that the system we're operating under is a bad system, and it needs to be fundamentally altered. Whether it can be or not, I honestly don't know.